Well, I had quite a dilemma of whether I should prepare for today if nobody came, and then the fact that if I do all this good work for 8 of you, and then next Sunday everybody comes in and they will have missed it, and how much do I repeat and catch them back up? So I'm not sure exactly what to do. Well, one of the things that if I'm not in the service, I'll use first service time and go kind of review what I've got. So I wasn't in the service today, and one of the things I reviewed what I got is I've got a 24-page graduate paper that I did on my D-Min program on this passage. It's kind of technical and academic, but I could do that instead of the other stuff, but I haven't had time to review it. I just found it. And it's got a lot of the same stuff, but it goes into a lot more detail. So I might just kind of use some of that to do the review next week. But here's where we were. We have the call. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I'll show you." And so he does, and then he gets there, and he finds the Canaanites in the land, and he builds an altar and sacrifices, we believe, at Shechem and Bethel, and then he goes on down toward the Negeb, and then in verse 10, when he gets down there, it says, "Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. And when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, 'I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, "This is his wife," and then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account.' And when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful, and when the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house, and for her sake he dealt well with Abram. And Abram received sheep and oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels." Now, in this accumulation of wealth at this point, there are a couple of interesting inconsistencies here. Male donkeys, and then male and female slaves, and then, oops, we forgot about the female donkeys. And so they add them, and then the camels is anachronistic. At the time of the setting that this probably was intended to be in this story, they hadn't domesticated camels yet. And the idea of Abraham being kind of a Bedouin kind of migrant didn't happen yet, because camels hadn't been domesticated, and the donkeys need water a lot more frequently than camels, so they couldn't have been those desert wandering Bedouin types at this time. So those images we need to kind of put aside. Those are not historically possible if we follow the expected timeline of when this is meant to be set. But anyway, to go on, "But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife," as if we didn't know that already. "So Pharaoh called Abram and said, 'What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, "She is my sister," so that I took her for my wife? And now then, here is your wife, take her and be gone.' And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him, and they set him on the way with his wife and all that he had." Are y'all familiar with this story? A little bit? It's not a real popular one to be preached about because it's kind of confusing, and it has Abraham not coming off too well by our modern sensitivities of good husband behavior. But anyway, Von Rad, in his commentary, is explaining that as we get into these stories after the part of where now the Lord said to Abraham, go forth, and so forth, then we have the stories of the patriarchs and how those stories are weaved together in order to tell the story of the children of Israel. But we encounter these stories that are very old, that have a lot of meanings of their own and have different purposes, that they were preserved up until the time that the Yahwist and then the redactor took them and worked them into their story of trying to tell us about the children of Israel. I didn't turn my phone off. It's going to ring loud here if I'm not careful. But anyway, the stories we can understand at the points of intersection when a story is inserted, the intro part and then the conclusion part, where the Yahwist or the redactor has to insert something to make the connection. Then in those places we can get some ideas of what the intention of those writers are, as different from the original intent of the stories that they were carrying. So when that appears, we will lift that up and try to get at what is the Yahwist or the priestly writer or the redactor trying to tell us about the Hebrew people and their relationship with God. But some of these stories don't have that as a part of them. They've got other agendas. Anyway, he also reminds us that this endangering of the ancestors is, or the rape of Sarah, as sometimes, there are three stories that have this theme in Genesis 20. 1 through 18 is an Elohist version, and let me just get over here and get the start of that. And this now from there it says, now from there Abraham, at this point he's turned into Abraham, journeying toward the region of the Negeb and settled between Kadesh and Shur, while residing in Gerar as an alien. Abram said to his wife Sarah, she is my sister. And the king Abimelech of Gerar sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream that night and said to him, you are about to die because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a married woman. Anyway, so on another journey, have the same situation. And then in 26, 7 through 11... Now Isaac settled in Gerar, and when the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, oh, she is my sister, for he was afraid to say my wife, thinking, or else the men of that place might kill me for the sake of Rebekah, because she is attractive in appearance. And when Isaac had been there a long time, King Abimelech, same king of the Philistines, looked out of a window and saw him fondling his wife Rebekah. So Abimelech called for Isaac and said, so she is your wife. Why then did you say she is my sister? And Isaac, anyway, that story goes on. So we have those three stories that are very similar, and but this is the one that first appears. And in my paper, I go into detail to say, all right, which story was probably first, and then the others were adapted from it, which is an interesting thing. I'll probably do next week, or we run out of time, start on it this week. But anyway, to move into this, in this place and in this context, we have Walter Brueggemann's commentary. He draws upon the idea of Abraham showing obedience to the divine call and going forth blindly, trusting completely, But then, when challenges occur, he becomes a man of little faith. He encounters a famine, and instead of trusting and waiting on the Lord, he immediately flees the trouble, and he looks for greener pastures, so to speak, across the border. And frankly, that's a very practical thing to do. People did that all the time, as we know, the migrations from one place to another. And in Africa, as the desert takes over arable land, and as things get worse, people cut down trees to burn for fuel, and then that makes the desert expand even farther. And so the migrations and so forth to find arable land and pasture for animals creates great tensions. And so that was going on in the Near East and the Middle East in these ancient times as well. But anyway, he crosses the border, and since it's not his own land yet, he's not making a dramatic action of throwing away all his possessions and fleeing with nothing. He's still on the move at this point. He's not settled there yet. He's kind of passing through. And so it's really not unusual or inconceivable that he would just keep moving south. That when he gets there and God tells him this is going to be the promised land for all your descendants, but it's not his at that time, so it's not a big deal to move on. However, since this is a story of Abraham, one of the patriarchs, the father of the Judeo-Christian Muslim faith, we think that he's supposed to be modeling great faith. But this is kind of compromised here. Now, it may have been that in the divine plan, before Abraham has little faith and takes matters into his own hand, it may have been that God brought him to the land at a time of famine, so that when the inhabitants of the land of Canaan would do the natural, logical thing and move off for greener pastures, then he could just kind of move in and take possession of the land without a big war. Now he doesn't have the population to fill the land, but yet he could have gotten a foothold in the land if he had stayed and waited for God to bring rain. But he doesn't. He moves on. So he can't do the finders keepers thing. But anyway, I didn't find anybody suggesting that. That's just one of my little thoughts I throw out there for us to think about. But Brueggemann writes that Abraham discovers that this promised land is a famine land, kind of like Sarah's barrenness. The land is famine land, and Sarah's barren, and so God's promises just aren't coming forth. God had promised me this, said if you will follow my guidance and go forth, then these things will happen. So he gets to the land, it's famine, Sarah is barren, and so he may have been kind of wavering here. I'm not sure following God is going to be all that helpful to me, but just hearing the story for the first time, it would be easy to wonder if in some way God was tricking Abraham or testing Abraham. I promised you a land that I would show you, and then when I show it to you, it's in famine. You have let me down, God. I trusted you, and now you let me down. Could have been what folks would think Abraham might have been thinking and feeling, so he scurries on and goes down to Egypt. But anyway, this story is inserted in the narrative and borrowed from somewhere else and set in there, and it's an older story. And as I said, there's two other places that we find this story. Now, the structure of this story, as it's told, has two main characters that speak. Abraham speaks, talking to Sarah, and it doesn't have dialogue talking to Pharaoh, but at the end of the story, when the other speaker, Pharaoh, speaks, he tells us that Abraham told him that Sarah was his sister. Now, there's a problem in the story, and any good stories have to have a problem to be solved, a conflict to be resolved. And so we've got a couple of problems to be resolved. The first one is the famine. What are we going to do about the famine? We can't survive in a famine, so the answer to that problem is to go somewhere else. And then the going somewhere else creates the second problem in that Sarah's a beautiful woman. They might kill me because of her, so we have to have this device to help Abraham stay alive because of that danger. So the moral of the story in this setting is simply God can be trusted even when we are unfaithful and aren't trustworthy. So in the story, Abraham comes off as a liar and a deceiver, and he risks Sarah for his own safety. But another part of this story is that in the beginning we have Abraham is the only one who's heard God's word. Up in this point, we don't have any dialogue that he has shared this revelation, this encounter with God, and brought Sarah into the circle of those who know. And so she is still just an obedient wife, sister, as the story is implying. So God, in rescuing Sarah, or Sarai, is showing us how important she is to this story. Before, it could have been easily understood that in her old age, she's no longer fertile. If Abraham is going to be the father of a great nation, Sarah is expendable. He'll have to find a younger, fertile wife to start this population. But in the story, God is saying, no, that's not the case. Sarah is just as important. That's why he has to rescue her. Now, E.A. Spicer, in his commentary, notes that the placing of this story right after the call to go forth is a way of placing Egypt as a focal point of the story and the patriarchal history into the thoughts and minds of those who are hearing and then later reading the story. It's preparing the listener for the big Exodus story. Spicer also gives the most extensive explanation of the wife-sister motif. In his research, Spicer discovered that in the ancient Hurrian society, and these are the folks where we had found when the courthouse burned down, all the records were these clay tablets with cuneiform, and when the fire came, it didn't burn them up like our paper records happen today. The clay form was baked and preserved. And so when they excavated it in our century or last century and found these records and started going through them to see what was in them, there wasn't a whole lot of theology, but there was a lot of records like at the courthouse, exchanges of property, marriages, and so forth. So in the research, he discovered that they had what was called a fratriarchal system, like fraternity or brother system. Now we've heard of matriarchal systems or patriarchal systems, where in the matriarchal, the mother is the dominant leader or the center of the orientation of the clan or the tribes in terms of property and power. And so in the marriages, the male leaves his mother and father and clings to the woman and her family or clan. In a patriarchal society where the woman leaves her mother and father and becomes part of the male family's clan or tribe. And still in our society, usually in marriage, the woman takes the husband's last name or surname, which is a part of that patriarchal kind of system. So anyway, Let's see. We need to, and all of that kind of developed because in close-knit societies, if you have too much marriages, then you start having these birth defects that come out when recessive genes start matching up with problems. And so the need to go outside of the group to find mates. So with that need, it developed different ways in different cultures. That's sometimes a matriarchal system, but still going outside of the clan to try to find mates. But this fratriarchy was a little different in that it was a more close-knit kind of system where there was closer intermarrying, so that the wife's sister among the upper classes it was a way of ensuring and strengthening the property claims of this family and holding on to the property. It couldn't run the risk of all these in-laws getting involved. We kind of kept it, or they kept it kind of close. So what it did is it created these marriages so that there was this legal claim to status and property. And from that, there were cases where, in order to strengthen the wife's status, they had adoptions. You would have a marriage ceremony, and then if you were in the upper class and you wanted to strengthen that relationship, then the wife would be adopted, and there were separate legal documents in the cuneiform that showed two separate actions. And in that process, also, if a brother rather than a father had given a daughter, but a brother gives a sister in marriage to someone, then that also carried that wife-sister bond and kept the family a little bit closer. The other aspect was that this strengthened the protection and elevated the status of that wife to a much higher level in the society, which again was an issue for the more privileged in the society. Now, with the polygamous practices, the wife's sister could also occur by the marriage of half-brother and sister relationships, as we find reported later, where we were told that, yes, Sarah or Sarai is actually Abram's half-sister, but from a different mother. Now, part of that is we're thinking later, trying to clean up the act so he's not a liar, turn him into, well, he's actually telling the truth. And then Isaac and Rebekah, they were given in marriage by brother Laban, which in the Hurrian society, as I said, carried the same legal status of wife-sister role. And then this legal distinction of importance, whether or not it's actual blood-kin relationship, is very important, is why they had the legal proceedings in the courthouse, and especially for leaders in the upper class. It also, the other part, it carried the freight of saying the woman is of equal class status as the husband. Nobody had to stoop to conquer. Nobody, was marrying below themselves, which is another kind of thing of trying to ensure the purity of the line, and particularly in genealogies where we're looking back on where did we come from. Well, our people came from the best stock. We are the best people out of the culture. And so the fathers and the mothers in the past, are nobility, as it were. And so we have claims that we are still a noble race or tribe. So anyway, that kind of aspect, the scholars are saying, is also going on. Well, anyway, how did this get into the Hebrew way of thinking and values? And they said the Hebrew clan lived very close to the Hurrians, and obviously the influences kind of bled over with that close association. We also can know that status played a role in the international relationships, as it were. In Pharaoh's court, they have records of the people from Canaan were called Asiatics, and often tribal leaders would show up down in Egypt, and they were like visitors in court. And so this was, again, a part of the motive of preserving the story, because if he was visiting the Pharaoh and welcomed and bestowed great gifts, then that means Abraham wasn't just, some lowlife. He was of great status to be welcomed at Pharaoh's court. And then this story of, Sarah being taken into the harem and so forth is, another aspect. But a part of remembering that story is to, again, tell the people listening to this that our people were noble people. So for the genealogical purposes, such things were important to be remembered. Now, Vaughter, in his research, reveals that the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, 2052 to 1778, before the Common Era, specifically seemed to have a high level in the Egyptian society, and they were very prosperous at this stage. And so it's highly conceivable that a pharaoh could show such generosity to one of these Asian chieftains who came to visit. So the reality of the time in history elaborated. They must be doing something in the control room. They're working on that mic over there that wasn't working. Anyway, they in this other commentary was saying that, and they just kind of made a big story out of it, filling in the gaps, was that everybody in Pharaoh's house was sick because God brought the plagues on them. But Sarah's running around feeling fine and healthy, and Pharaoh was asking, how come? And then that's how it kind of comes out, or could have come out. But this story in the Bible doesn't tell us how Pharaoh came to know, and so then also, how did he make the connection between the plagues and the fact that Sarah was there, that this was coming from God? That's not really explained. It's just kind of assumed. But then there's another question, and it doesn't really say, was Sarah's chest or her purity compromised, and so the plagues are punishment for Pharaoh violating Sarah? Or were the plagues sent to protect her? Because Pharaoh got so sick, he didn't feel like going into the harem. It doesn't say. So whichever way you want to believe it, you can interpret it that way, because there's no evidence one way or the other. But in an early stage of the story, in this male-dominated polygamous culture, Sarah is really only secondary part of the story of Abraham's wisdom and shrewdness and growth and wealth and power as a patriarch. But the theology of the biblical writers and the editors changed the focus from Abraham to God. And it's God's faithfulness to the promises that God, as the God of history, is leading and guiding all of these events, and that occasionally God has to intervene to rescue different people in order to continue God's plan and goal in the history. So in that case, it's a foreshadowing of the Exodus out of slavery in Egypt. And, so often the sense of violation. We know that rape is not a sexual act in the sense of intent. It's an act of hostility. It's an act of great humiliation and degradation. It is not meant for sexual pleasure. It is something else that's going on, and therefore it becomes a metaphor for that kind of violation and abuse in other settings. And so the whole people of Israel, in a sense, are treated in this violent way in their enslavement. Dana Fuel, in her reflections from the feminist theologian viewpoint, points out some interesting aspects of the story. And again, she questions Abram's motives in this story. And she asks, is he really worried about his life? Is he really in danger here? Or is he just kind of exaggerating that in order to make Sarah a tool or an instrument for his profit and material gain? So he comes up with talking about her beauty, and her beauty is making him unsafe. So if she refuses to go along, then he would be killed, and then she would feel so guilty that she didn't save her husband, and it would be her fault. And so that manipulation is something that Fuel kind of is questioning there. And also this reversal of the Genesis 3:16, which makes sexual desire residing in the woman. After the expulsion from the Garden of Eden said that the woman will desire her husband, but he will rule over her. So Fuel is seeing that, well, if the desire is supposed to be in the woman, yet here she's not expressing any desire, but the desire, sexual desire, comes from the male side, and this uncontrolled desire of lust causing murder and rape because of the woman's beauty is the real cause there in the story. So again, we have, or very early, we have blame the victim in this story, which is contemporary. We hear that all the time. Well, you wouldn't have gotten raped if you weren't wearing those sexy clothes and that sort of thing. But at the end of the story, we see that the Egyptian men no respect for others' property, even female property. The Egyptians come off with a little more integrity than Abram, for Abraham deceives both Sarai and Pharaoh, and he shows himself as a liar and a panderer if you look at the story from that perspective. Now, again, since her age has made her barren, and God's promise to Abraham does not specifically include Sarai in that early part, the fulfillment would be logically just to mean taking a younger, fertile wife, as I said before. So, in this perspective, it appears that he sacrifices Sarah's safety for his own safety, but assuredly he sacrifices her and her, in a sense, safety or her purity and integrity for economic gain, because he gains a lot. Now, Sarah's silence in all of this shows her powerlessness. Sarah kept silence and did not go along with Abraham's lie to Pharaoh, for as we hear, Pharaoh later criticizes Abraham. You told me. He doesn't say, you too told me, but just blames Abraham for the lie. And again, God sees the injustice, and he lets Abraham and us know that Sarai is not expendable. Now, the situation in Egypt, as Abraham's lack of faith and trust in God leading him to this deception and creating the need for God to rescue Sarai by inflicting plagues on the Pharaoh and his house, does another reversal. God was going to give him the promised land, he would make a name for him so that he would be a blessing to other people. By you, other nations will be blessed. And now it's by this ruse, Pharaoh's family, his household, have received a curse. They are not blessed. So in Abraham's behavior, he is causing situations that upset God's plan and purposes. And in order to rescue Sarah, then God has to go against God's own plan and will in order to solve this dilemma that Abraham has gotten them into. So Abraham doesn't seem to learn from this event, and he continues, because we see it repeated again later with Abimelech of Gerar. So anyway, well, that covers what I had prepared, because I wasn't sure how many of you would be here. Any questions about this story? Yes. Well, we're not sure, but it could have been in that middle kingdom of somewhere in, let's see, it was the 12th or 2052 to 1770 something period, where this kind of thing would have been likely in the 12th dynasty, but not real sure which Pharaoh it might have been possible for this to happen. However, I don't know if you were in yet when I had said I was up in my office, and I've got a 24-page paper that I did on this passage in seminary when I was working on my D-Min program, and one of the things that my research showed was that the probability that the original story came from Isaac and Rebekah going into the area of Abimelech, the king of Gerar, and Isaac saying, "This is my sister," to Abimelech, and then he has a dream that says, be careful about what you're doing, and that the Yahwist takes that story model and then uses it to create a story about Abram and Sarah and this going down to Egypt to make that foreshadowing of the Exodus story. And so it has so many parallels. Again, like I've said several times before, Abraham as the father of the faith, and these stories are reaching so far back in order to interpret and emphasize that God has been a part of this all along. It's the God of history. And so these the formative time, the real formative time of the Hebrew people was the Exodus. That God had seen their enslavement, and God heard their cries. And who is this God? Well, one of the best ways to describe this God and this God's nature is not so much I am who I am or I am who I will be, the Asher, A.A. Asher, but this is the God who frees slaves. This is the God who cares about the widow and the orphan in the land. And so that formative event of the Exodus is the big part. But so much from that formative time, then the question is, well, how did we get down there in slavery? And so the story of, and then where did we come from? Where did we start? And then all the way back, well, how did the world start? And how is this God of history different from all the other gods? So all of those questions are the reason we understand so much of the stories that are put together to answer those questions. What kind of a God is it that frees the slaves and cares about the widow and the orphan, who's concerned about justice? And so it's a developmental growth process of God working with these people and saying, even before the Exodus, this God was at work. This God was helping these things along. And we as God's people are still trying to figure out how we can respond appropriately and be God's faithful followers and not mess up, preventing God's ultimate goal and purposes for how the world should be. And as long as we keep messing up as the people's side, then God's plan and will keeps getting delayed. That make a little bit of sense? So anyway, in answer to that, then there probably wasn't a particular Pharaoh, because it may be doubtful whether Abram and Sarah actually went down to Egypt. But anyway, we do have evidence that it could be from some of the extant records of the time that it's conceivable for this to have happened, but just because it's conceivable to have happened, it doesn't necessarily mean that it actually happened that way. So, anyway, this story is not unique, and in my research before did come down to a sense that possibly the Isaac and Rebekah story was the first and could well have been an actual event as well for them. And so it does raise a lot of questions. Well, I've run out of stuff today. Does anybody have any other questions that I haven't had time to review my paper and find other little gems or pearls of wisdom and insight? Okay. Oh, okay. Yes, because it's Advent. And Advent has an agenda all of its own. And the other part is that we will have Christmas Eve communion. And so we'll have communion this month, but it won't be first Sunday. It'll be Christmas Eve. But yeah, that was... I had to ask that because I was first reader last week, and when I got on the calendar and saw that, I had to ask, are we doing communion? And because if we do the communion liturgy, a lot of times first reader doesn't have to do the pastoral prayer. And I don't know about the other folks, but I spent a lot of time working on that prayer because I wanted to kind of thematically fit what the rest of the service is doing, but also try to get a sense and feel with what are you all feeling about what's going on in the world today, and how do we respond to those things that are happening around us here in Tulsa or around the world with these horrible cataclysmic events. Like the hurricane in the Philippines and those kind of tornadoes and wildfires and shootings all over the place where innocent people are killed. How do we respond to that? So I try to bring that into the prayer and spend a lot of time on that. So if it's not in the order of service, I don't have to I don't have to do that. But if it's there, then I've got to be ready for that Sunday morning. So I didn't know, so I had to ask myself, is this going to happen like we planned? So, and that raises a question, what's going to happen first Sunday in January? part of what's happening now with David's new leadership is that we are re-examining lots of things that we're doing, and you've noticed a lot of little tweaks and changes, and there are a lot of things that David hadn't quite decided about. and I think in the news and the Word, we had the Christmas Eve announcements of what's happening. Well, that was wrong, and I think Sherry was waiting for David to make decisions. It wasn't up until late last week or so, David hadn't decided what he thought was best for Christmas Eve. Historically, one of the associates preaches the 11 o'clock service, and Dr. Biggs had done the two main services, but David decided that he thought, since this is his first year, that he would preach all three of those. But he hadn't made up his mind yet, and Sherry has to get out the announcements, and I think she was waiting, and then other things came up, and then last year's agenda went out in the Word. No, it's not going to be Dr. Biggs, and it's not going to be Bill Crow. That was is supposed to be on the rotation. I'm supposed to be up for Christmas Eve this year if we stuck to the old rotation. But that's not going to happen. But I'm up next week for the longest night service, and then I don't know. David announced he's planning on taking vacation time and going back to the old style where the senior minister works real hard and gets through Christmas Eve, and then the first Sunday after Christmas takes a vacation and is gone. And so that's his plan, and so I'll be up to fill the pulpit on the 29th. But I don't think that's out there yet. So y'all are on the inner circle of what's about to happen, unless it changes, and that's this kind of unsettling time of change, trying to figure out if we're going to change something, we want to do it right, and so we need to think it through and not just go kind of crazy with things. But there are so many different things happening. It's sometimes haven't had all the time to bring everybody in on it and have a good thorough discussion, and then after it's decided, get the communication out to everywhere it needs to be. And so we've had a few things that kind of fell through the cracks, but seem to be working out well. Y'all happy? Mostly. We got, I think, a majority of folks liked the jazz stuff a couple of weeks ago, but there were a few that didn't at all. So we're working. Oh, yes. Yeah, the jazz thing was for the ones that didn't care for it. I think what happened was that Joel was spending extra money to hire those folks and wanted to get his money's worth. So they played lots of the service. And when they played lots of the service, the folks that didn't care for it, it was too much. And then, because folks loved it and clapped, it really gave it a feel that this is entertainment and not worship. And so that left a really unsettling feeling for those that didn't care for it. And so we're going to be evaluating all of that and trying to get a proper balance. And it's not going to be, and one of the things, some of the folks who weren't happy with it got this fear that it's going that way and it's going to be that way all the time, when it's not meant to be that. We're going to experiment and going to try this and going to try that, and just to keep it interesting and alive and vital and so forth. But change is hard. It's hard. And so we need the folks who aren't happy with things to let us know and find out what was it that was uncomfortable, or how did you understand that or see that, so that if it's a misperception, we can explain and get a proper perception. And if we need to say, well, it's time to have different settings for those different kinds of services. Maybe for those that love it, they're willing to come at a different time. For those that are unhappy, if we say, well, you've got to go to another time, our risk is they're going to say, no, thank you, I'm going to go to another church. And we don't want that to happen. So, I don't know. I doubt it, but my famous last words, that's not my department. But my department is pastoral care. Is if you're hurting or you're upset or distressed, I'm here. I'll listen. I'll try to help you cope and deal with those things, and I'll take your thoughts and feelings into the planning and evaluation sessions, and try to help us work through and come out better and stronger and more fulfilling in our ministries and our worship. So, well, thanks for those questions. I hope my answer is helpful and I don't get in trouble for what I've said. Well, let us pray. It's time for our hour to be up. Well, dear God, you are the one who calls us to go forth and do things and go to new places and experience new things. Sometimes we're afraid and we don't want to go, and sometimes when we go about it in the wrong way and we mess up and bad things happen, and you have to intervene to rescue us. So we pray for your gracious love and your forgiveness and your abiding light to guide us and help us come out in the right place when we start these journeys to new places. In Christ's name, amen. Whoops. Off, on, off. All right. Next time.